This afternoon, we have Simon Kornblith with us. In AI and science, or in AI and ML, we have the situation that actually academia is not necessarily the driving force everywhere. We also have industry being a big point. So it's a special delight for me to have Simon here from Google. Simon is currently a staff research scientist at Google DeepMind, and he works on representation learning, computer vision, and natural language processing. He got his PhD in 2017 from MIT. And before that, he got his bachelor's from Caltech. He still publishes. That's one of the nice things, that industry still lets people publish in AI and ML. So we benefit from that still. And you can find him. Also, one thing, you may have used his tools. He's one of the first developers of Zotero, the citation management software. So, but now we talk about ML and machine learning, and especially we'll see structure in neural network representations. And with this, I'll welcome Simon to the stage. Thank you.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so thanks for the introduction, and also like it's great to be here. I mean, I think like my talk is going to be more about like scientific understanding of neural networks than about applications of neural networks to science. But I hope it's all also going to be of interest to you. So today I'm going to talk about structured neural network representations. And to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to say, I'm going to start with like an introduction to the concept of representations in neural networks, where this came from, what a representation is exactly, and why we should care. After that, I'm going to talk about ways of measuring similarity between representations in neural networks, and maybe also like in various places where you have representations that are not neural networks. First, using centered kernel alignment, which is a technique for measuring representational similarity, where I guess we didn't invent the technique, but we pioneered it for this purpose. And I think like that'll serve as a good foundation to talk about other ways that we can think about measuring similarity between representations. That's going to be like the first hour of this talk. After that, I'm going to talk about some more practical things. Like I'm going to talk about validating neural network similarity measures. So if we want to try to figure out which of these techniques we should use to measure similarity between neural network representations, how do we do that? After that, I'll talk about actual applications of these techniques to understand neural networks and what they do. And finally, I'm going to end by talking about some open questions in neural network representations and representation learning. Some sort of scientific mysteries about how neural networks work that I don't think we're really close to solving yet. So first, some introduction. So what is this word representation? What does it mean? So one definition that I think is pretty good comes from this review article in neuroscience from Christopher DeCharms and Tony Zador. And they say a representation is a signal that is used in a transformation of information. It must carry information content about the input to the transformation, and it must have a function in determining the results or output of the transformation. So if we have a system that can be sketched out sort of like this, where we've got some input, and then there are these successive stages of transformation, and then there's some output all the way to the right, then the representations are the things that are in between the transformation. It's the information that's being passed from one stage to the next here. So in the brain, the representations are activity of neurons in different brain regions. So for example, in primates, a visual input will first trigger neural activity in the retina, and that's the input here. That goes into neurons in the thalamus. The representation from the thalamus gets passed into the primary visual cortex, then to secondary visual cortex, to visual cortical areas B2 and B4, and from there to the frontal lobe of your brain, where it can directly trigger a motor output. So the form that the activity takes obviously evolves as it passes through each of these regions, and that's like where the value in studying the representations comes from. In a neural network, the different layers don't have special names like brain areas do, but the principle is sort of similar. There's information that's passed from each layer to the next in the form of activations until we get to this final layer here, it's layer 5, and then the neural network will provide some kind of output. So you might ask, like, why should we care about the representations inside a neural network? Like, can we just care about the output and not care about what's happening in between the input and the output? And there are two reasons that we should care about these representations. The first is sort of a practical one. We know that starting with a representation from a neural network that is like trained to do one task makes it easier to solve other related tasks. And so the figure that I'm showing here is from like a CVPR workshop paper from 2014. In this paper, the authors take just the representations from one of the last layers in the convolutional neural network that's trained on ImageNet. It's an AlexNet style network. And they compare the performance of training a support vector machine classifier on this representation to do a whole bunch of different computer vision tasks to what you would get if you had instead used the traditional computer vision pipeline to perform these tasks. And the traditional pipeline is sort of complicated, like it involves all of these different stages, which people have sort of hand built. And what they showed is actually like the neural network representation works as well or better than the best state-of-the-art hand-built thing across all of these tasks. And so this is like one of the things that made everyone in computer vision decide to give up on the classical methodology and just go to neural networks. But like the basic idea here is all you have to do is learn some good representation and suddenly lots of things become easy. And for this audience, I think like another appeal of representations might be their potential for allowing us to understand how complex information processing systems actually work. And so a particularly influential example of this kind of understanding comes from the work of David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel, who studied the representations of the cat visual system to try to figure out how cats see the world. So before Hubel and Wiesel, it was known that the retina and the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus contain neurons with these kind of centers around receptive fields. So they respond to points of light in some part of the cat's visual field, but then they're inhibited if you show light around that point of light. So Hubel and Wiesel decided that they wanted to look at the next stage of visual processing. So they went to primary visual cortex, which is actually in the back of the brain. And they found that the neurons in primary visual cortex, they don't just respond to points of light, they instead seem to respond to oriented bars. And that's consistent with the idea that they integrated responses of many LGN, lateral geniculate nucleus neurons that are responding to adjacent locations in space. That's how you can build up a neuron with that kind of selectivity from neurons with this kind of selectivity. They further divided these neurons into simple and complex cells. So there are simple cells that just respond in a single place in the visual field. And then there are these complex cells that have some amount of spatial invariance inside the receptive field. So you can move the bar around a little bit and a given complex cell will still fire. So this kind of understanding of how information is represented in primary visual cortex ended up being hugely influential both in neuroscience and in AI. So these findings directly inspired Fukushima's neocognitron, which was sort of the first neural network that had this idea of localized receptive fields. And later, both directly and through the neocognitron, it inspired the development of convolutional neural networks. And so like, in fact, all of deep learning is sort of a toy model of the kind of representations that neuroscientists were studying in the mid-20th century. So I asked Jeff Hinton where the idea of representation learning came from. And he said that like a big inspiration was the work of Carl Lashley. So Carl Lashley wanted to find the engram, the biological basis of memory in the brain. And to do this, he trained rats to run through a maze, and then he destroyed parts of their brain. So he thought that maybe the memories, like that they need to run through this maze, they reside in some part of the brain, and you can figure out which part of the brain they reside in just by destroying different places and figuring out what kind of damage actually hurts the rat's performance. Instead, he found something sort of weird. So he found that the deficit seems to be monotonically related to the amount of brain that was damaged. And he reached this conclusion that the memories are actually distributed across the entire brain. So we now know that this isn't quite correct. There are actually parts of the brain that are more important for memories for memory than others. But the basic idea that the memories are distributed across very large numbers of neurons does seem to be correct. And this is like very different from the standard like von Neumann architecture computing paradigm, where your memories are stored in just one place, and then you read them out later. And it led cognitive scientists to search for a way to build models that actually have some kind of representations that are distributed across many different neurons. So the most influential of these models was and still is, I guess, backdrop. So like lots of people get upset with the idea that like Rummel, Hinton, and Williams get credit for backdrop because actually they were not the first people to train multi-layered neural networks using like reverse mode automatic differentiation. But what Rummel, et al. Actually did show is that backprop can solve this representation learning problem. Like you can learn a representation with backprop. You can learn how to store memories in a way that is distributed across many neurons. And like also like it seems like if you look at layers of the neural networks that you've trained with backprop, like there's some sort of evolution of the complexity of the features in those different layers. And if you read the accompanying commentary in the issue of Nature that the backprop paper was published in, it's actually all about the value of backprop as a model of cognitive representations. There's nothing in there about how this is going to let us build like human-like AI or anything. But today it is true, like this kind of representation learning with neural networks is actually the basis for all of our most advanced AI systems. So there is like this sort of frustrating part about this paradigm, which is that it leaves important questions about how these systems work undetermined. And this is sort of how it gets its power, but it's also pretty frustrating. So David Marr suggested that there are 3 levels that we should be able to explain in order to understand how an information processing system works. So the first level is this computational level. What does the system do and why? Then there's the algorithmic and representational level. How does the system do what it does? And then the implementation level. How are the algorithm and the representations physically realized? So if we think about how we map these onto neural nets, the computational level is pretty easy. So we have some data, we have a loss function. We're using some variant of gradient descent to train the network. And that's why it fits the data. That's why like it's able to do whatever task we trained it to do. The implementation level is a little more complicated, but it's also like all stuff that people understand. So it's like some about the details of machine learning, from the way that we implement automatic differentiation down to the fabrication process of the microchips that people are using. So that leaves like this algorithmic representational level, like how does the system do what it does? And I don't think like there is actually like an easy way to answer this question. like from first principles. The problem is like we are not specifying this representational level. We're explicitly not specifying this representational level. We're instead telling the network to learn this representational level itself. And so that means if we want to understand what's going on at this level, we're actually going to have to look inside the trained neural network and figure out the solution that it actually found. So like this algorithm that the trained neural network implements, it arises from some interaction between its architecture, the data, and the learning algorithm. And we can't like mathematically describe the data. The data is generally like it's too complicated. It's stuff from the real world where we can't write down an equation that will give us the same probability distribution. And usually that's why we're training a neural network in the first place, because we can't actually like create a complete mathematical description of the data. So to understand the algorithms that a neural network actually implements, we need some kind of tools to look inside them. And so with that, I'm going to move on to talking about one of these tools, which is centered kernel alignment, a way of measuring the similarity between representations within and across neural networks. So in the previous slides, like the definition of representation that I was using is pretty abstract. For the remainder of this talk, I'm going to use a more concrete definition of a representation. So when I say the word representation, usually what I mean is a matrix that looks like this. So the rows of the matrix correspond to different data points, and the columns correspond to different neurons. So we're going to compare representations. So we need two of these matrices. We can call them X and Y. They both need to have representations of the same data points. So we need to have the same number of data points, and also like each row in X has to correspond with the row in Y. But these representations can come from different layers of the same neural network. They could come from layers of different neural networks. And we don't necessarily need to have the same number of neurons in either representation. We want to know, we want to be able to answer questions about the relationships that don't depend on like any precise alignment between the neurons or their number. And for simplicity in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to assume that the means have been subtracted from each column. So for each neuron, we've taken the mean activity across the entire data set and subtracted that. So if we think about comparing representations, then we want to come up with some similarity measure, which takes in two of these matrices and then gives us some scalar value, which says like, are these similar or are they not? And this is like a difficult problem to solve. Like there are many ways that we can think about doing this. And like, even if we just think about similarity between two vectors, there are many ways that we could think about computing similarity. So there's no single way to compare two vectors. The simplest possible approach in terms of the mathematical operations that are involved is simply to take the dot product between our two vectors. And we can take that dot product and call it similarity. So more generally, we can think about what would happen if we transform both of the vectors before taking the dot product. For example, like we could normalize them both to unit length or something. And I'll talk more about this later, but to start with, I just want to talk about dot product as a measure of similarity. So what happens if we want to compare two representations by comparing vectors? So if we take each of the neurons in one of our representations and we measure its similarity with all the other neurons in the other representation, we do that for all pairs of neurons, one coming from X here, one coming from Y, we can get a new matrix that tells us how similar all of our neurons are to each other. And because we're measuring similarity here with the dot product, this just amounts to doing matrix multiplication. So it's super simple. So that's one way that we can think about building up some notion of similarity between matrices. Like there's another notion which I'm about to show you is very related to this, where instead of comparing the neurons directly, we're first going to compare each of the data points from one of the representations. So we're going to measure the similarity between the data point representations in X to get this new matrix XX transpose. So every element of XX transpose says how similar is this data point to this other data point according to X. So we have this like inter-example similarity matrix. Now we want to compare it with another inter-example similarity matrix. And so to do that, we can first think about taking it and reshaping it into a vector. So just stacking all of it, all of the columns on top of each other. And again, like we're just using a dot product to measure similarity. So we can compare these two inter-example similarity matrices. And now we're going to get some number out that represents the similarity of the inter-example similarities. So like the interesting part here is like you write this down mathematically, like you simplify it and you can see actually like the sum of the squared dot products between the neurons, this thing on the left is the same as the similarity, the dot product between these reshaped inter-example similarity matrices, this thing on the right. And so like to turn this into a similarity index that is actually useful, we don't want it to be the case that if we isotropically scale X or Y, we get more similarity. Like we don't want it to be the case that like we just multiply X times 10 and now everything is more similar. So we need to somehow correct for that. And so like that's what the normalization here in the denominator does. And this gives us a similarity measure that's between 0 and 1. And now it tells us how similar these matrices are. And this is like a pretty simple idea. And so it's actually like known under a bunch of different names in the literature. So like in machine learning literature, like before our paper, it's like centered kernel alignment with a linear kernel. But also like in older psychology literature, it's the RD coefficient or Tucker's congruence coefficient. So like the fact that we're calling this linear centered kernel alignment immediately suggests that there's a nonlinear extension. And indeed it's true, like there's a nonlinear extension that we get simply by considering this idea of transforming the vectors before measuring the similarity. So like for every example, every data point, we have some vector representation, the activity of the neurons in response to that data point. And we can just take that representation and apply some function to it. And the function that we apply to it is called the feature map phi. So sometimes it's going to be easier to directly define or compute the inner product between these transformed representations than it would have been to directly apply the feature map and then compute the dot product. And so we can define this function k here, which is the inner product between those two transformed representations of two data points. And this function is called the kernel. Beyond the linear kernel, which would just be the dot product, like a common choice is the radial basis function kernel, this thing here, which sort of resembles a normal probability distribution function. So it's sometimes also known as the normal kernel. And the feature map, like that corresponds to the RDF kernel, is actually infinite dimensional. So like you can't actually directly compute the kernel by applying the feature map. But at the same time, like we know that such a function exists. And so we can still compute CK here and it will still make sense. And the way we do that is actually super simple. So in the previous expression for CK, we had these matrices XX transpose, YY transpose, which are just the matrices of the inter-example similarities. We can take those matrices and we can replace them with these centered kernel matrices. We get these matrices just by, instead of measuring similarity between all pairs of data points using a dot product, we measure similarity between all pairs of data points using our kernels K and L. Usually they're probably going to be at least the same kernel family for both of the representations, but they don't necessarily have to be. And then like we do this funny thing to get K tilde from K. And what we do is we simply subtract the row means and the column means from K. That's what this matrix H is doing here. And the reason we do that is that it's equivalent to this centering operation applied to the neurons after applying this feature map. So before I said that, like, we were assuming that the neuron means were subtracted from the matrix, that the columns all have zero mean. If you can't actually construct that matrix X, you can accomplish the same thing by multiplying on both sides with this matrix H. Okay, so why use a nonlinear kernel? Like, what's the difference between using a linear kernel and a nonlinear kernel? The answer is, like, different kernels are going to emphasize different kinds of structure in our representations. So in practice, we might have representations that have some kind of structure that looks at least a little bit like the thing on the left here, but probably a lot higher dimensional. So there are some clusters here, and then those clusters themselves also have some arrangement in the larger space. And so depending on the kernel that we use, we'll either emphasize the way points are arranged inside the clusters, or we'll emphasize the way the clusters themselves are arranged. So if we just use the linear kernel, which is a fancy name for the dot product, then we see the corresponding interexample similarity matrix, which is shown on the right here, mostly emphasizes how the clusters are arranged. So the orange part points in the top part of the similarity matrix. They're very far from the blue, red, and pink points. And then the red points are close to the blue points and the pink points. And the blue points and the pink points are sort of close to each other, but not as close as they are to the red points. So, like, we can now think about what would happen if we instead used an RBF kernel. Something different is going to happen now. And if we look at the form of the RBF kernel, we can see that whenever the distance between 2 points is much larger than this RBF kernel bandwidth sigma, the output of the kernel is going to be approximately 0. So we can actually explicitly control whether we care about the local structure or the global structure by manipulating this bandwidth. So if we set the RBF kernel bandwidth to 1, now we get like a very different kind of similarity matrix between the examples. So now, like, none of the clusters are similar to any of the other clusters. The similarity is always 0. And instead, like, we see some gradations in how close individual points are to each other within a cluster. And so, like, if you don't care about whether clusters are moving around in the space, and you care more about what is happening inside the clusters, you probably want to use like an RBF kernel with a smaller bandwidth. If we increase the kernel bandwidth to 2, now all the points inside each cluster are really similar to each other. So now the between cluster similarities are still pretty close to 0, but you can see now, like, they're sometimes greater than 0 between the red cluster and the blue cluster, and the blue red cluster and the pink cluster. And if we further increase the bandwidth to 5, then we begin to get something that looks a little bit more like the linear kernel, where the red cluster is pretty similar to both the blue and pink clusters. The blue and pink clusters, or sorry, the blue and pink clusters still are not very similar to each other. And everything is still maximally dissimilar from this orange cluster. So, like, depending on what kind of structure you care about, like, you have this problem of how do you pick the kernel. Like, in the past, like, I think most people just use the linear kernel because it's easy and it doesn't have this hyperparameter that you have to pick. But, like, probably there are good reasons to use an RBF kernel with a smaller bandwidth, like, because we often probably don't care all that much about the very global characteristics of the structure. So a practical consideration before we really go too much further. So it seems like if we want to naively compute CKA on a large data set, we need a lot of memory. So we have to like construct these kernel matrices, XX transpose. And to do that, like that's a number of examples times number of examples matrix. And if we're going to compare like a lot of layers from a neural network, and there are going to be a lot of those matrices, and you're probably not going to be able to fit all of those matrices in your GPU memory. And also like you have to construct those matrices first. So you actually need to store all of the example activations before you build that matrix XX transpose. So there is like a trick that lets you do this a little more easily. So those terms in the numerator and denominator of CKA that involve interexample similarities, there's actually like an unbiased estimator for those terms, which looks sort of crazy, but it's not too hard to implement. And you can actually compute that unbiased estimator on mini batches. And if you average across enough randomly sampled mini batches, you can show that, like, because this is an unbiased estimator, the unbiased estimator on those mini batches sampled from where the points are sampled from your original data set, which is the distribution, it will converge to the value of the same estimator computed using the entire data set. So you can do all of this without actually having to load all of your activations in memory at once. Yeah.
First of all, thank you. This is all super interesting. I'm curious about the random sampling. Like, would we maybe care more about if we wanted to know how similar representations are, about having a diversity of sample points so that, you know, representations are totally different on more rare samples, that we pick up on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so like all this will be sensitive to the actual samples that you're using to compare, to measure similarities. Yeah, like you can obviously like reweight things if you want to and put more emphasis on some of the examples. I haven't really given much thought to this sampling question, so I can't give a good answer about how this is going to affect things. I do know like in the past we've done stuff where like ordinarily if you sample from a data set, you're going to have samples that all belong to different classes. Like you'll have a lot of diversity that way. Like we measure CK using all of the classes in a data set, or just like using an individual class from the data set. And usually the similarity heap maps, like the actual similarities between layers across networks, they look pretty similar to each other no matter how we do it. But I think there are probably some cases where it will matter like exactly what's going in terms of what comes out.
Thank you.
Okay, so like now that I've talked a lot about CK, I want to talk about the relationship between CK and other approaches to representational similarity, some of which actually might be familiar to you. So like the first thing that's like very closely related to CK is this idea of representational similarity analysis in psychology and neuroscience. And really like CK is just a variant of representational similarity analysis. There are other approaches out there that instead try to fit one set of features with another, and then measure the goodness of fit and use that goodness of fit as like a similarity measure. I'm also like going to talk a little bit about extensions of these measures that provide pseudometrics that satisfy the triangle inequality, which you can use for interesting visualization purposes and maybe other purposes as well. And like finally, there are these recent papers that propose these sort of alternatives to these more classical similarity measures that use stitching. So with stitching, you actually take the representation from some layer of some neural network, and you pass it into the top part of some other neural network. So it's actually a way of measuring compatibility between the representations of one model and part of another, rather than directly measuring similarity between two matrices. Okay, so first, like representational similarity analysis. Like CKA, representational similarity analysis involves constructing inter-example similarity matrices for two representations and then measuring how similar they are. So traditionally in RSA, these the pairwise similarities, the similarities between the examples are Pearson correlations, and then you compare these two matrices using Spearman correlation. This is not that different from CK. In CK, like the pairwise similarity can be like anything that's a kernel. Usually it's a linear kernel. Sometimes it's an RDF kernel. And the matrix similarity, instead of being Spearman correlation, it's cosine similarity after centering the rows and columns of this inter-example similarity matrix. And actually, like after you've done the centering, cosine similarity is the same as Pearson correlation, so it's like another correlation measure. And there's also an alternative expression for CK, like in terms of the similarity between these features rather than the similarity between the data points, although depending on the kernel, you might have an infinite number of features. So like really the reason to think about CKA instead of RSA is just that there is some interesting mathematical stuff that we can do with CKA that is a little bit harder with RSA. And I'm going to show you that like in the process of relating CKA to some other representational similarity measures. Yeah.
So for this infinite wide neural networks like neural tangent kernels, is there like a kind of CK that can be used like because I kind of visualize extensions so
yeah like in principle, like the neural tangent kernel is just another kernel. Like you can do CK with the neural tangent kernel. I don't know of anyone who actually has done that, but like in principle there's no reason that you couldn't. I think like in practice the neural tangent kernel ends up being a little bit painful to compute. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about representational similarity by goodness of fit. So rather than directly comparing features or examples, we could instead try to find this fit between one set of features and another. And so like methods to do this, like the most obvious method to do this is just linear regression. We can try to fit a representation X using the neurons in our representation Y. Another method is canonical correlation analysis, which tries to linearly transform both of these representations to a common space so that the correlation is maximized in that common space. And then a third option is orthogonal Prokrutsky. So we can learn an orthogonal transformation rather than an unconstrained linear transformation to fit one representation with another. And it turns out like we can actually relate all of these methods with CK through the singular value decomposition. So like I probably most of you have seen the singular value decomposition at some point, but I'll give like a very brief sort of refresher. So if we have this matrix X, the singular value decomposition lets us decompose it into these matrices U, sigma, and V transpose. So we can get it back as the product of these three matrices. This matrix U is an orthogonal matrix, so that each column has zero dot product with all of the other columns. The columns are are called the left singular vectors, but they're also like the principal component scores normalized to unit length. So if you think of the first vector U, the way you can interpret the first vector in U is you think about the direction of maximal variation in your data set, and then you project each point onto that direction of maximal variation. And similarly, like the components after that, they're directions that are orthogonal to that, and they represent the second most variance or third most variance, etc. So this matrix sigma is a diagonal matrix, so it has zeros everywhere except on the diagonal. The diagonal elements are called the singular values, and their squares are the amount of variance that the principal components explain. So there's like a singular value that corresponds to each of the left singular vectors. And it's more convenient to think about the squares than the singular values themselves. And so I'm going to represent them as lambda. And technically the variance should be divided by n, and this is not divided by n, so it's not really the variance. If you divide this by n, you will get the variance, but for simplicity, I'm going to ignore this factor n for the rest of the talk. And then we have this matrix V transpose. So these are like the actual directions of the principal components in this space. But also like, we don't really care about these. So like if we were to rotate X, then this matrix V is the only thing that changes. U and sigma don't change. And like, we don't care what happens if we rotate X, at least for now. We only care about similarities between the examples, and we don't care about the axes in the original space. So we actually, we can just ignore V for now. So we have these two matrices, X and Y. We have to do the SVD of both of the matrices. And now we can think about what CKA is in terms of the singular value decomposition. So if you look at the numerator of CKA here, we have the squared dot products between all of the vectors of principal component scores, these U vectors from the SVD. Those are squared, and then they're weighted by the amount of variance explained by the corresponding principal components. So like, if there are directions that explain more variance, then we care more that the scores along those directions are similar between our two representations than if they explain less variance. And the denominator here again is just something that we need to ensure that this is between 0 and 1. Okay, so that's CK, and now we can think about linear regression in terms of the SVD. And so like this is linear regression between two matrices, but you can still sort of think about this as it's still equivalent to like what would happen if we took every individual neuron in X and fit it using all of the neurons in Y. We get some matrix B that tells us how to recover or get as close as possible to X from Y. And we can ask how much variance is left after we subtract this best fit from X. So how good is that fit? And to get something that has nice properties, we need to then divide by the overall amount of variance in X. Like again, so that if we were just to rescale X, we wouldn't get a different similarity measure. And so this is like R squared, but it's sort of a matrix generalization of R squared. So again, like we can write down R squared in terms of the singular value decomposition. And if you look at this, like one of the cool things is you can actually compute the goodness of fit without ever computing the parameters. Like it's just a matter of the dot products between your left singular vectors and then like the singular values of X. And if you compare this to CK, you can see the difference is like whether you're weighting by the amount of variance explained in X or the amount of variance explained in both X and Y. And there's also this difference in the denominator according to what you're doing. Okay, so we might be looking at this and wondering, like, what if we don't weight by variance explained in either of the representations? And the technique that is associated with that singularity measure is called canonical correlation analysis. So in canonical correlation analysis, we look for linear combinations of neurons from X and Y such that we take those linear combinations, we'll maximize the correlation between those two linear combinations. And this is how we get the first CCA correlation value, this rho sub 1. to get more CCA correlations, we need to do something to make sure that we're not just like recovering the same linear combinations. And to do that, we add this additional constraint that our new canonical variables, the stuff that we get as linear combinations of neurons, have to be orthogonal to all the previous canonical variables. And then this gives us more canonical correlations rho sub I. So now we can think about how to turn this into a singularity measure. And one thing that you can do is sum up all of these canonical correlations. They're never going to be more canonical correlations than the rank of the lower rank representation. And we can sum their squares and then divide by the number of correlations. So we're taking the mean squared CCA correlation. And again, like we can write this down in terms of just now U, and we see it's the sum of the square dot products between all of the pairs of singular vectors divided by the number of neurons in the smaller representation, or really it's rank, but usually these representations end up being full rank. So again, like comparing this to CKA, we see the difference is about this weighting. Now, with CCA, we are weighting all of the directions in the space sort of equally, and with CKA, we were weighting by the amount of variance that they explain. There's another technique that's called singular vector CCA, which I guess is common in ML literature, I guess. And this is also really simple. So if we want to compute singular vector canonical correlation analysis, we would first reduce the number of principal components in X and Y, like create some low rank version of X and Y, and then do CCA. But we don't actually have to construct those representations. We can just truncate the singular vectors that we're computing the dot products between. So we can select two numbers, K1 and K2, which are less than the full number of neurons in X and Y. And usually people like select K1 and K2 so that they're explaining like 95% of the variance in the representations. But it seems like in practice, maybe you actually just want to set these to some small but fixed number. Okay, so like you might, we have these three basic methods, CKA, linear regression, and CCA. We see there are these differences in how they weight the actual singular, the square dot products between our left singular vectors. You might ask whether there's something in between or some way to get something in between, and there is, and that's this thing. So this is a similarity index that's derived from canonical ridge, which is a regularized form of CCA that's related to ridge regression. Usually if people say regularized CCA, regularized canonical correlation analysis, they mean this canonical ridge thing. And like CKA, the numerator here involves the squared dot products between all of the principal component scores weighted by the lambdas, which are, again, the amounts of variance that they explained. But now we're dividing these factors by the lambdas plus these regularization hyperparameters kappa X and kappa Y. So we can show when the kappas are 0, we recover CCA. When one kappa is infinite and the other is 0, we recover linear regression. And when both kappas are infinite, we get something that's sort of like CKA. The denominator here actually does not correspond to the CKA denominator, but it's upper bounded by the CKA denominator. And so I'm going to talk about like one more of these sort of ways of measuring similarity by goodness of fit, which is orthogonal Procrustes. So in orthogonal Procrustes, we're doing something a lot like linear regression, but instead of trying to fit X using any linear combination of the neurons in Y, we instead restrict ourselves to orthogonal transformations, or to rotations. It turns out that we have this solution for how close this is going to be. And it looks like this. So we have just like the norms of X and Y squared minus this thing on the right, which is the sum of the singular values of X transpose Y. And so like, again, we have this problem here that if we isotropically scale X because we've restricted ourselves to this class of orthogonal transformations, then the distance is going to go up. And we can fix that pretty easily just by normalizing these matrices. And again, now we're going to find the solution for these normalized matrices. And because the norms of the matrices are now 1, it simplifies to this thing. So this is a distance and not a similarity measure, but like and it's between 0 and 2, not between 0 and 1. I think it's pretty clear how you can turn this into a similarity measure between 0 and 1. So we just do that, and we can also take out these Frobenius norms and put them in the denominator here. And so now we have this Procrustes-based similarity measure, which is again pretty similar to CK, but now it's the sum of the singular values instead of the sum of the squared singular values in the numerator here. So the Frobenius norm, the squared Frobenius norm is also like the sum of the squared singular values. So the difference here is something about the norms, and like it's not really clear to me like what the difference here is in practice. But you can do either of these things, and people have actually done both of these things in practice to compare neural networks. So if we want distance metrics, with the exception of linear regression, like these similarity measures sort of conform to what we would expect from a metric. They're symmetric, but they don't satisfy the triangle inequality. And so there's a simple trick we can do. We can take like our cosine of either the CK measure or the Procrustes measure, and we get something that's really a pseudometric and not a true metric. And it's a pseudometric because in a true metric, we would want it to be the case that the distance is between our two representations is 0 only if they're the same representation. But in this case, like we actually want representations to be like the same if they are permutations of or rotations of each other. And so the reason you do this is to construct embeddings of representations, for example, for visualization. And that's what we did in one of our papers. So we took 2,000 different neural networks trained as part of a neural architecture search benchmark. And then we constructed embeddings of their layers using multidimensional scaling. And like with a Procrustes pseudometric. And then we did PCA to further reduce the dimension. And so that gives us this, like each box here is representations from a different part of the network. They're like the stem is the base part of the network, and then the average pool layer is at the top. And the points are colored according to their arrangement in stack 1, and you can see that the arrangement is reasonably consistent in the other boxes as well. Okay, so one more method, an entirely different kind of method is stitching. So the previous methods will work with any representations, any matrices, not just representation from neural networks. Stitching is really specific to neural networks. So in stitching, we will take part of one neural network. We'll take the bottom part and we'll connect it using the stitching layer, which is usually just a linear layer, to the top part of another network. And so then we can train that stitching layer to perform the original task and measure the performance on that task. So stitching really measures the compatibility between the activations from one network and the architecture plus weights of another. So it's not really comparing the representations so much as like looking at whether one representation can substitute for another. And I'll show you some more slides about this later. But I think we're close to break time now. So I want to like take some questions, and then I'll tell you more about applications and like how we actually use these things with neural networks.
Hi, sorry, this question might be a bit of a leap, but I'm curious if you've like, so you said most of the metrics are symmetric, but like, and then there's the one that isn't, but I guess I was curious if there's like connections here to sort of metrics that are used in information theory, like either like K-L divergence or mutual information, and like, I guess, have you guys looked at those? And
Yeah, so I will talk a little bit about mutual information after the break. But I think like the problem with mutual information is that in principle, mutual information is invariant to any kind of invertible transformation of your data. And like that makes it both like impossible to measure and sort of like also maybe meaningless for understanding what's going on in a neural network, because often like the transformations that are happening in a neural network are actually invertible. So I think like people have various ways to measure mutual information, but then like when you apply those in practice to understand what's going on in a neural network, you're really measuring properties of those mutual information approximations as opposed to mutual information itself.
okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was just curious that these methods and what you mentioned at the end about the stitching method, do you think that these would help with the kind of understanding and learning more about bringing like from different models like representations closer, or like helping with probably what I'm trying to get to is like reduce this knowledge loss when we are trying to build models for that are not only effective for one task, but one can work with.
Yeah, so like for multitask problems or maybe catastrophic forgetting problems. Yeah, I mean, I think like potentially this could help. Like I think like if you can maintain information and representations that's useful for one task, then like that seems like it should help you in those sorts of situations. I guess the question is like, what are the constraints then that prevent you? Like if you can maintain the activations but not the data points, then what regime does that correspond to? But assuming there is such a regime, like I think this would help.
Any further questions?
Thank you for the talk. What is the advantage of using stitching layer? Why don't we just continue the output from the third layer and just go onto the fourth layer on the first image itself?
Yeah, so it's not about performance. It's like about like trying to figure out, do these networks actually process information in the same way? So like the intuition here is that like if the stuff from layer 3 of one network can substitute for the stuff from layer 3 of the other network, if it can still give you good task accuracy, maybe it means that there's similar information, a similar representation in this layer 3 as in this layer 3.
What's frozen here?
What? So usually everything is frozen except the stitching layer. So you're only training the stitching layer. Does that answer your question? I can. Yes. Okay.
Like, why not to just like borrow one layer from other network and just, or other than just breaking it half and half?
So why do you need the stitching layer?
Not the stitching layer, like you broke two networks in half and then
Yeah.
stitched them. Instead of, oh, okay, I'm sorry, then you would need two stitching layers if you have just, if you are borrowing just one layer from other network.
Oh, so yeah, so like you don't necessarily have to stitch the network in the middle. You could stitch it earlier, but like, yeah, I guess generally people, you could conceivably like do something where you just try to use layer 3 from one network. I think that's what you have in mind. I've never seen anyone do that, but it seems like it's something you could conceivably do.
Yeah, thank you.